Hollywood in the mid-20th century wasn't just a dream factory. It was a fortress of carefully managed illusions. The actors we adored were crafted into flawless figures by the studios, each with an immaculate public image designed to win hearts and sell tickets. Magazines printed fairy tale romances, movie premieres rolled out endless red carpets, and press junkets painted these men and women as living symbols of the American dream. But behind that facade, a much darker reality thrived. Some of the most iconic stars of the era didn't just rub shoulders with underworld figures, they depended on them. The mob's involvement wasn't the kind of casual connection you might expect from a chance meeting at a charity gala. It was deep, personal, and often career-defining. Organized crime in America during the 1940s through the 1960s wasn't a fringe element. It was a parallel power structure with its own rules, codes, and currency. The entertainment industry was irresistible to mob bosses. It offered money laundering opportunities, a direct line to political influence, and perhaps most importantly, an endless supply of public legitimacy. Being seen with a star, even quietly, could soften a mobster's image and open doors. For the actors, the arrangement came with its own set of benefits. Protection from paparazzi, help negotiating better contracts, and the kind of problem-solving no agent could match. It was an unspoken agreement, favors for favors, loyalty for opportunity. But as many would learn, walking that line meant constantly balancing on the edge of a blade. And no one embodied that dangerous balancing act more than the man who would become both the face of the Rat Pack and the mob's most famous friend, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's career was the stuff of legend, but his offstage associations were every bit as storied and far more controversial. By the early 1940s, Sinatra had already established himself as one of America's most beloved singers, his voice carrying across radios in smoky nightclubs and family living rooms alike. But as his fame grew, so did whispers of his friendships with some of the most notorious figures in organized crime. The names Sam Giancana and Lucky Luciano didn't appear in Sinatra's publicity material, but they were fixtures in the stories told behind closed doors. The most infamous tale came in 1947, when Sinatra allegedly flew to Havana to deliver a suitcase to Luciano, who had been exiled to Italy but was visiting Cuba for a high-level mob conference. The FBI's Havana files suggest the suitcase contained a large sum of cash, intended as payment for services rendered or investments yet to come. Sinatra denied wrongdoing, but the damage was done. The incident became a permanent part of his lore. These connections weren't just about socializing. The mob reportedly used its influence to secure Sinatra prime performing spots in mob-owned casinos, particularly in Las Vegas, where Giancana's reach was strongest. In return, Sinatra provided the mob with access to elite Hollywood circles, sometimes hosting private gatherings where entertainment power players mingled with underworld heavyweights. It was a symbiotic relationship, but one that came at a cost. Every favor pulled Sinatra deeper into a world where one misstep could be fatal, not just to his career but to his life. And Sinatra wasn't alone in this delicate dance. Another member of the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, would find his own fortunes tied to mob generosity. Dean Martin was the picture of effortless charm. On stage, he seemed immune to stress, whiskey glass in hand, delivering smooth jokes between songs. To audiences, he was the embodiment of a man who had it all and didn't have to try. But that cool exterior was reinforced by something far more tangible than charisma. It was backed by the quiet but unmistakable presence of the mob. In Las Vegas, mob-owned casinos controlled the best stages, and Martin's Rat Pack performances were guaranteed prime billing at the Sands, the Riviera, and other venues where mob influence was heavy. These weren't just business arrangements, they were protective alliances. Martin could stroll into a high-stakes poker game or a packed nightclub knowing that no one would cause trouble, because troublemakers tended to vanish from mob-controlled properties. There are stories of Martin's debts, both gambling and personal, being handled by friends in the underworld, no paperwork required. And while Sinatra drew more public suspicion, Martin managed to keep his image cleaner, possibly because he avoided flaunting the connections that kept his world running so smoothly. Still, insiders knew the truth. His stability, his untouchable aura, and even some of his biggest professional breaks were made possible by an unspoken agreement with dangerous men. But if the Rat Pack members were in the mob's good graces, another music icon's mob ties came through someone else entirely. His manager, a man who operated more like a general than a promoter. Elvis Presley's meteoric rise from Memphis truck driver to the king of rock and roll has been told countless times, but less discussed are the shadows that lingered over his career. Shadows cast by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Parker was a Dutch-born showman with a history so murky that much of it remains unverifiable. What is known is that Parker had a knack for cutting deals that gave Elvis the most lucrative stages in America, and some of those deals reportedly had mob fingerprints on them. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Parker booked Elvis into venues controlled or influenced by organized crime. The casinos and theaters in question weren't just places to perform, they were hubs for laundering money, networking with other mob-connected acts, and securing contracts through negotiations that didn't always involve lawyers. Parker himself was rumored to have gambling debts, which some say made him particularly susceptible to doing business with the mob. While Elvis himself may not have been directly involved in mob dealings, the environments Parker placed him in ensured he was never far from their influence. There's even speculation that certain tour routes were chosen less for fan demand and more to satisfy obligations to mob-connected promoters. Whether Elvis knew or cared is another question entirely. The king was focused on the music, but the men around him were playing a much more dangerous game. And just as Elvis was unknowingly linked to the mob through Parker, Hollywood's brightest blonde Bombshell found herself under federal surveillance for her connections to dangerous men. Marilyn Monroe remains one of the most enduring symbols of Hollywood glamour. But her life off-screen was a complex tangle of fame, romance, and rumor. By the early 1960s, Monroe had attracted the attention of the FBI, not for any crimes of her own, but because of the company she kept. Declassified FBI files reveal that agents monitored her friendships and relationships closely. She was linked romantically to high-profile figures, some of whom had documented mob connections. There were also political concerns. Her rumored associations with the Kennedy family overlapped with organized crime investigations, leading to fears that she might have overheard or been told sensitive information tying political figures to mob activities. The files are heavily redacted, and much of what they contain remains speculative, but their very existence is telling. Monroe wasn't just a screen siren, she was a person of interest in a high-stakes web that combined Hollywood glamour, organized crime, and political power. And yet, she kept working, kept appearing on magazine covers, kept smiling for cameras, as if the danger swirling around her was nothing more than another role to play. But the mob's influence in Hollywood wasn't just about individual stars. It seeped into the films themselves, financing productions that became cultural milestones while concealing criminal profits. In the mid-20th century, producing a film required enormous sums of money, and studios weren't always eager to risk it on projects without guaranteed returns. That gap in funding created an opening the mob was more than willing to fill. Through silent partners, mobsters funneled illicit cash into film productions, using Hollywood as a sophisticated money-laundering machine. These investments weren't acts of charity, they were calculated moves. A mob-backed film might feature certain actors as a favor, or be shot in locations controlled by mob-linked businesses. In return, the producers gained financing that came without the oversight of banks or traditional investors. And for the mob, the box office receipts could be adjusted to hide the true flow of funds, blending illegal earnings with legitimate profits. Some industry insiders from the era have claimed that certain blockbuster films only got made because mob money was on the table. For actors, landing a role in such a production could mean instant stardom. but also a permanent debt to the people who made it happen. Refuse the next favor, they asked, and you might find yourself blacklisted, not by the studios, but by men whose influence reached far beyond Hollywood. And while this influence over stars and films was powerful, it was still only part of the bigger picture. The mob's most strategic move was yet to come, and it would target the men who controlled everything, the studio bosses themselves. The actors may have been the face of Hollywood, but the real power rested in the corner offices of the studio heads, men like Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohn, and Jack Warner. These were the gatekeepers who decided which films got made, which stars rose, and which careers ended overnight. They also became the mob's ultimate target. Behind closed doors, whispers of under-the-table deals, protection payments, and secret files began to circulate. Studio bosses, some say, were as dependent on the mob as the stars they employed. Only their stakes were higher. Control the bosses, and you controlled the entire industry. That's where our story picks up tomorrow. We'll step inside the boardrooms, back rooms, and smoke-filled lounges where Hollywood's most powerful men found themselves answering to an even more powerful shadow network. Tomorrow, how the Mafia infiltrated the studio bosses.